Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Grace, and this is episode 26 of the KMG show. Got the impression today that things might be turning around, that this panic might be abating, which is very good news indeed. Uh, President Trump, at the beginning, took the view that the coronavirus threat was being wildly exaggerated for political purposes and also because the media wants clicks. He was then, so it seems to me, bullied into the belief that we're all going to die and that the American economy must be shut down for as long as it takes. And how long might that be? Well, people were talking about up to 18 months. Well, he's gone back to his original position. He tweeted half an hour ago, "Together we will prevail." He had a press conference and he spoke to Fox. And 15 days to slow the spread. That is the message. The White House said small businesses power our economy, and President Trump won't let them weather this all alone. Our people want to return to work, he tweeted. They will practice social distancing and all else, and seniors will be watched over protectively and lovingly. We can do two things together. The cure cannot be worse by far than the problem. Congress must act now. We will come back strong. So Trump spoke to Fox, and he wants it over by Easter, which is April the 12th. I'm reading from the summary, the Daily Mail. We lose thousands and thousands of people a year to the flu. We don't turn the country off. I would love to have it open by Easter. I would love to have it open by Easter. I will tell you that right now. It's such an important day for other reasons, but I will make it an important day for this. I would love to have the country opened up, and they are just raring to go by Easter. His policies recommended no social gatherings over 10 people, which has closed several hours of worship and sent religious services online. Actually, as far as the Catholic Church goes, they just decided to throw in the towel several weeks ago. They didn't need to be pressured. I guess there was a Jesuit theologian named Karl Rahner. He was very influential. He wanted a more modest flock. The Catholic Church was growing by leaps and bounds right up to the early 1960s when the disaster of the Second Vatican Council happened, and it has been hemorrhaging members for all sorts of reasons since then. But as far as the little flock of Karl Rahner goes, the Catholic Church just decided, no, they want no flock. And I will be talking about that in greater detail later. The White House guidelines also recommended not eating at restaurants but ordering takeout, which would prevent Easter brunch reservations. But the president said his timeline for return is realistic. I think it's possible. Why isn't it? We've never closed the country before. Easter is a very special day for me, he told Bill Hemmer of Fox News. The churches aren't allowed essentially to have much of a congregation there, and most of them I watched on Sunday fall in line. I think Easter Sunday, and you will have packed churches all over the country. I think it would be a beautiful time, and it's just about the timeline that I think is right. Give us more chance to work on what we're doing, and I'm not sure that's going to be the day, but I would love to aim it right at Easter Sunday so we are open for church service and services generally on Easter Sunday. Would be a beautiful thing. I'm very pleased by this. Because I think that resolution is better than panic. Although Nicholas Taleb seems to think differently. So the New York Times, not very happy about this. Trump defying experts, talks of easing restrictions by Easter. The experts, who are never, ever wrong. Except that they didn't see, 2008 coming, for instance. that no, the housing market's not a bubble. Why would you say that? Are you some sort of defeatist? The economy is strong and it's going to get stronger. I could list many such examples. Well, I'll mention AIDS again. Oh my God, it's everyone's disease. We're all going to get it. And nothing like that happened. But specifically, what does Brett Stevens think about this? Oh, him and Gail Collins. Yeah, a real Algonquin roundtable there. That let's see. Gail says, you remind me a bit of Mitt Romney circa 2020, our new moral hero. Yeah, this is what the left has been reduced to, claiming Mitt Romney not only as one of their own, but as a hero. Brett responds, I'll take that as a compliment so long as I don't remind you of Mitt Romney circa 2020. You know, Tom Bethel and Joe Sobran came up with this phrase, strange new respect, some decades ago. You have a person who is hated by the elite, and then they capitulate to the elite, and suddenly they're greeted with a strange new respect. And this is what's happened with Mitt Romney. So Gail says, I'm pleased we started out with the more cosmic questions today, but I've got to admit I'm itching to get specific about the terribleness of Donald Trump. His press conferences have been sort of scary. Whenever he makes a sweeping medical decree, you can see the health experts blanching. Do you think we'd be in a better place now if we had a different president? Brett says, let me think. Yes. Our colleague, Jennifer Senior, had a great column the other day calling these press conferences what they truly are, propaganda. The deep problem with Trump is that he completely squandered whatever remained of the moral capital of the presidency long before any of us had heard of the coronavirus. So even if he were getting everything right, and he hasn't, he would be failing at his task because he inspires zero trust with at least half the country. Gail responds, well, some people certainly like him. I've been trying to keep alert during the press conferences by counting the number of times our alleged coronavirus leader, Mike Pence, reverentially mentions his boss's name. In 5 to 8 minute presentations, the score very seldom drops below 20. Brett says, consider the contrast with our governor, Andrew Cuomo, who has really risen to the moment with the right combination of compassion and authority, or the contrast with past presidents. The overwhelming majority of Americans rallied around George W. Bush after 9/11, just as the country rallied around Franklin Roosevelt after Pearl Harbor. Both men enjoyed a certain baseline of respect that transcended policy differences. Trump never did and still doesn't, which makes him so utterly unsuited for the moment. Yeah, I remember George Bush. I'm sure most of our audience remembers George W. Bush. That the media thought he was an absolute clown. They said he looked like a monkey, a chimp, that he was a dry drunk, an overgrown frat boy. Yeah, that's how much the media respected George W. Bush. The country rallied around Jimmy Carter in 1979 and 1980 as well. I suspect the Democrats are feeling rather like Ted Kennedy did in 1980. Ted Kennedy made a disastrous run for the presidency. You know, it was his time, right? He gave a terrible interview with Roger Mudd of CBS where he was asked, why do you want to be president? And he didn't have a clear answer. But Jimmy Carter played what was called the Rose Garden strategy, that America's in a crisis, I got to stay in the White House, no time for petty politics. And that worked very well for him. It certainly snuffed out Ted Kennedy's campaign, but of course, Jimmy Carter lost to Ronald Reagan in November of 1980. Let's see, Brett says, in the meantime, Gail, then there's this little matter of a vice presidential selection coming our way, which seems to be coming down to Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren, and Amy Klobuchar. Yeah. Gail says that she's tilting a bit toward Klobuchar because she was a better presidential candidate than Harris back in the day, and she's also not so old. Brett says, well, my dream ticket, at least of a few months ago, would have probably had Klobuchar or Mike Bloomberg at the top, and someone else, maybe Pete Buttigieg as Veep. But I'm grateful the Democrats look set to nominate someone I can actually vote for, as opposed to Warren or Bernie Sanders. Has anyone been paying attention to Joe Biden? It's pretty funny. It is pretty funny. He gave a statement on this, which was filmed in his home in Delaware, and it was a short statement, but he managed to say exactly the opposite of what he meant to say. And then he was interviewed on television, what was it, yesterday or today, where he coughed into his hand. And he was chided by the interviewer saying, that's pretty old school. He actually used that phrase, that you're supposed to cough into your elbow. And then Biden compounded the gap by saying, well, I'm at home, so it doesn't count. And then he got bullied again by the interviewer. Well, yeah, okay, it does count. I'm going to be coughing into my elbow from now on. It's just too funny that Gail Collins and Bret Stephens are pumping up the candidacy of a man who would never really amounted to anything, vain and shallow for decades in the Senate. And now he's out there looking like the Joker with his skin stretched so tight because of all of the plastic surgery he's had, and pretty much unable to get through a single sentence without mangling it somehow. Typically, as I said, saying the exact opposite of what he meant to say. The piece in the New York Post by David Harsanyi of The Federalist is pretty good. He says the cynical partisan opportunism of Democrats exhibited during the coronavirus economic crisis has been breathtaking. Rather than move forward with a quick, no-frills, massive $1.8 trillion rescue plan, Democrats decided to hold the country hostage by trying to cram through a slew of lefty goodies that have absolutely nothing to do with the pending economic crisis. As corporate boards struggle to figure out ways to keep their companies afloat, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi is demanding that they spend time filling gender and racial quotas down to subcommittee assignments. As the transportation sector wrestles with a once-in-a-century economic disaster, Democrats are trying to compel airlines, which have seen a 90% drop in customers, to cut greenhouse gas emissions every year until they hit a 50% reduction. If Pelosi keeps this up, airlines are going to see a 100% reduction soon. As small businesses lay off workers, Democrats held up a federal loan program so they can pass more wind and solar tax credits, fund NASA's Environmental Restoration Group, what is that, and study climate mitigation efforts. As millions of Americans are filing for unemployment benefits, crushing state government budgets, Democrats held up a rescue bill so they can give government employee unions extraordinary collective bargaining power. Rather than move quickly, Pelosi is demanding that the Senate federalize elections, setting up same-day voter registrations and provisions for conducting audits of elections. In other words, overturning elections. The GOP Senate bill was 500 pages. The Pelosi bill I read was 1,120 pages. Reportedly, there is another version of the rescue bill circulating that is 1,400 pages. Who knows how many more political pet projects will be stuffed into this iteration of the bill. So the Dow had a big day, one of its biggest days in history. Let's see what NBC has to say. It rebounded more than 11% in one day. That's the best day in 87 years. It closed 2,113 points higher. The S&P 500 was up 9.4%, NASDAQ up 8.1%. So does this mean that the stock market has found its bottom? Well, according to Jeff Cox of CNBC, markets experts see no clear path forward without signs the coronavirus is passing. We're going to have to see the infections pass an inflection point, said Vincent Reinhardt, chief economist at BNY Asset Management. Everyone is an epidemiologist now. So, okay, Governor Andrew Cuomo of New York. On Twitter, you can find a compilation of 6 videos where Governor Andrew is being interviewed by his brother, Chris, aka Fredo Cuomo, and this is absolutely hysterical. That Fredo seems to be alternately terrified of his brother, and then he shifts to a position where he cannot bother to keep his hatred of his brother from, filling his voice, his face. How did Chris Cuomo get on TV? Actually, that's a rhetorical question, because I know very well why Chris Cuomo got on TV, because of his surname. But, I'm no beauty myself, but then, of course, I'm talking to a few hundred people. I'm not talking to a CNN audience. But Chris Cuomo has 2 expressions. Half the time, he looks as if he's about to burst into tears. And the other half, he has, as Dan from Beep described Jonah, he's got that surprised masturbator face. He's just so comical. From the Daily Mail, you choose the 26,000 who die. Governor Cuomo slams Trump for sending only 400 ventilators when New York needs 30,000, as Army sets up the first 1,000-bed field hospital in Manhattan. Cuomo said that it would peak in 14 to 21 days, and the state is not ready for the influx of patients. Overnight, there were 2,500 cases in New York City and nearly 5,000 in the state of New York. Trump refuses to enforce the Defense Production Act because companies are volunteering to make supplies. In the U.S., there are now more than 50,000 cases of the virus and more than 600 people have died. New York is the epicenter, but Cuomo warned the rest of the country will see similar numbers in weeks. How does he know this, by the way? I sometimes get the impression from these people that this is what they are hoping for. According to the Mail, Cuomo's math was off. If every sick person who he says needs a ventilator didn't receive one from the federal government, the true death toll would be even higher at 29,600. So let's see. Oh, yes. Postal voting. According to Just the News, House Majority Leader Steny Hoyer, I believe that's how it's pronounced, said on Monday that no decision has been made with regard to allowing lawmakers to vote from remote locations during the coronavirus pandemic amid a breakout of the infection on Capitol Hill. How would that work exactly? Would you have to go onto a telescreen, or could you just press a button, or perhaps send an email? Is that how it would work? Last week, Hoyer, who's a Democrat from Maryland, said that he expects the House to adjust its voting procedures to comply with the latest CDC recommendations. And yeah, we're talking about postal voting. Just to repeat, postal voting means we bring the fraud to you. It means vote harvesting. It means the end of free elections. I believe this is mandatory in Oregon already, and it may be mandatory in Washington. Well, they only elect Democrats there anyway. We saw what happened in the latest midterms, where the Democrats were the Republicans were breathing a sigh of relief because the day did not go too badly for them, and then the votes kept coming in. Days later, they kept coming in and coming in and coming in, and it turned out to be a very bad election because of vote harvesting. The very idea that something called vote harvesting could be permitted is an absolute outrage, But that is the situation that we find ourselves in. So just the latest update from where I am, and I will get back to it. Oh, we're up to 44 cases on Vancouver Island. 44, and not a single death. I believe the latest figures are that there have been 13 deaths in British Columbia, the province where I live. British Columbia has a population of 5.1 million. 10 of those 13 deaths have been in a single old age home in North Vancouver, where it appears the patients, the average age of the patients in this home is 87. And a nurse got it, and she infected all these old people, and 10 of them have died. So it's not exactly panic stations where I live, except that it is panic stations. The Empress Hotel, which has long been the sort of symbolic capital of Victoria, apart from the legislature, which is the capital of British Columbia, the Empress Hotel has been ordered closed. I walk down my street and I see all of these businesses closed, and I wonder how many of them are going to come back. Greta Thunberg says she may have coronavirus and is isolating with her father after displaying symptoms. The teenage activist said her father, Svante, was also suffering from the disease. The pair believe that they became infected while on a train tour of Europe this month. Thunberg said that she had mild symptoms, but her father had more intense illness. We haven't heard much from little Greta lately, I suppose, because her would-be apocalypse, has been superseded by another would-be apocalypse. But you notice how all these celebrities have the coronavirus? It's almost as if they've been enlisted. I saw F1 champion Lewis Hamilton. He said that he had a chance. He's a man who obviously travels a great deal. He had a chance to be tested for the coronavirus, and he said no, which has led to speculation that he might have, as they say, other health conditions. Well, one in particular. Let's go to the chat. Experts. The media seems to have a vested interest in promoting a state of panic, beginning with their local weather reports, says Jim Smith. Well, if it bleeds, it leads, they say. Of course, I've wondered about this, that so much of the news is, okay, here's a man standing in front of an empty building and it's dark. Well, earlier today, blah, blah, blah. Why have you sent a man to stand in front of an empty building in the dark? You have so much of that. I remember a few years ago, there was a air crash. A plane went down in the Atlantic Ocean, some miles off the coast of Nova Scotia. And the CBC had these cameras trained on the black inky sea. Now, even if the plane was there, you wouldn't be able to see it, but they've got a very strange idea of what constitutes visuals in TV today. Brandon Smith says, under Obama, this pandemic would get all the positive spin possible. Yeah, I'm going to get around to what the Canadian media is saying about our revered leader, Justin Trudeau, who was his coup attempt, his attempt to have himself proclaimed caudillo, failed today. Bernard Bright says, are you doing a segment on the gold market tomorrow? Seeing a lot of tweets about the COMEX and London market today. Maybe the coronavirus is the straw that breaks the paper markets back. Well, I will write that down now in large letters. And yeah, I'll work something in about gold tomorrow. Brandon Smith again says H1N1 infected 60 million under Obama and flew under the radar. Yes, I have to say, that I had, heard of H1N1, heard less about it than SARS, because SARS was apparently a very big deal in Canada, although it affected overwhelmingly Chinese people. But H1N1, when I saw 60 million people had it, I thought, no, that can't be true, because if 60 million people had a deadly disease, well, we'd all be pissing in our pants, right? Again, this convinces me, or persuades me rather, that it's all politically motivated. Jonathan Paul says oil may go down to $10 a barrel. So much for the corrupt leaders of Kurdistan. Well, if that's the world price, what is it going to be in Alberta? $2 a barrel? $1 a barrel? Brandon Smith again, media is the most potent delivery system of the mass brainwash. Well, yes, exactly. People have talked about the power of the media for decades, but it's only now we learn just how powerful it could be. Jim Smith says, I think the media are throwing out stalking horses in the event of a Biden collapse. Well, we have seen something of a boomlet for Andrew Cuomo. I don't like the man, but obviously in comparison to Joe Biden, he seems like a titan. David Wright says Biden and Madonna have the same plastic surgeon from 12 Monkeys. Apparently Nancy Pelosi turns 80 on Thursday if she makes it. Lango says, I'm putting myself out there again. Madonna hairbrush karaoke is to me her best look ever. Let's see. Great Lakes Nationalist says, not clear yet whether coronavirus plus symptoms will be regarded as a status symbol or an actual stigma showing weakness. It seems to be a status signal now, certainly. Chad Chadson, our moderator, says, poor Greta always worries about things that she can't control. Right Flag says Trump will not go through with his promise to end the lockdown. It happened before. Well, as always, we shall see. Great Lakes Nationalist again says Greta will boast that she is stronger and wiser, having endured corona. Big spike in demand for physical silver, yet the market price has crashed. I suppose what a lot of people don't know about silver is that, well, gold is primarily, hoarded or used for jewelry. About 50% of silver is used for industrial applications. So there's a big difference between the two metals. Okay, so let's talk about martial law. Where do we have martial law? We have martial law in Hungary. Now, Viktor Orban has been accused of being a tyrant, and he is suspended. Democracy there is going to rule by decree, at least until the end of the year, but, people had been calling him a tyrant for years. Boris Johnson has decided to play the tyrant in Britain. And Premier Ford of Ontario has decided to play the tyrant in Ontario. Now, there's a lot of people who accuse the New Democratic Party of having, authoritarian tendencies. But to his credit, Premier John Horgan of British Columbia has said that no, he does not believe that such extreme measures are necessary at this time. Alyssa Milano, yes, tell us, what do you think, Alyssa? Texas is using the coronavirus to prevent access to abortions. Well, at least some good is coming out of it. According to Oliver Lane in Breitbart, the British government has ordered people to stay in their homes and only to leave in a very limited number of circumstances, as well as banning public gatherings of more than 2 people in an attempt to slow the spread of the coronavirus. Addressing the nation on Monday evening after a 3-hour meeting of the government COBRA emergency planning group, did they get that from G.I. Joe? Prime Minister Boris Johnson said that measures announced so far, which included ordering pubs, bars, and restaurants to close and advising the public to stay at home, were no longer enough to prevent coronavirus spreading through the country too quickly, explaining that slowing the development of the virus was the government's key priority, as preventing too many new cases emerging on any given day would prevent the national health infrastructure from being overwhelmed. The Prime Minister told the United Kingdom, "The time has now come for us to all do more. From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home." By what authority he can order this is an interesting question, and I just wonder, the traditional guff that we get from British politicians, noble traditions of liberty, blah blah, standing, solitary bulldog against Hitler, etc., etc. Are we going to keep hearing that after this fiasco? In a far-reaching lockdown that brings Britain in line with the harshest regimes imposed on European nations in the depth of the coronavirus, the Prime Minister announced a national emergency that was to last for at least 3 weeks. British residents will not be allowed to leave their homes, except in a very limited set of circumstances, and the right of assembly is being severely curtailed, with no more than 2 people who do not live together being permitted to meet together in public. Well, I guess it's rather difficult then to protest against Al Johnson's dictatorial regime when you're not allowed to protest against it. It's against the law. The acceptable reasons to leave the home were to shop for food, and even then as infrequently as possible, to exercise once a day, to go to hospital, or to travel to and from essential work. Underlining that these points were no longer suggestions, the Prime Minister told the nation, "If you don't follow the rules, the police will have the powers to enforce them, including fines and dispersing gatherings." Making clear that members of the public should stop seeing their friends, the Prime Minister went on, "You should not be meeting friends. If your friends ask you to meet, you should say no. You should not be meeting family members who don't live in your home." So let's get this straight. Britain is a country where people break the law and the police don't care. As Peter Hitchens pointed out a couple of years ago, for some time, British police have been simply issuing tickets to people for up to very serious crimes, including sexual assault. They can't be arsed because they've got more important things to care about, specifically mean tweets, and more specifically still, mean tweets aimed against trans people. The Daily Telegraph, a pro-conservative paper with links to the government, reports the fines are likely to be £30 for congregating in groups of more than 2 people. In addition to the restrictions on individuals, the government was also closing all non-essential business, being most, except food and medicine retailers, and for all religious services to be canceled, except funerals. Peter Hitchens tweeted, Alexander Johnson, he calls him Alexander because that's his actual Christian name, and everyone in his family and his friends call him Al. He has some Circassian blood in him, and I suppose he thought it would be exotic to have the Russian name Boris as his front name. Alexander Johnson places Britain under house arrest. There is no outrage here. Appearing among us is the abolition of liberty, which I have so long warned against. Yes, and apparently, if you complain about this, this makes you a traitor. This seems to be the media position because, our leaders know exactly what they're doing, and they have only our best interests at heart, and they wouldn't be prone to panic, or they wouldn't be prone to aggrandizing their power at the expense of our ancient liberties. No, 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 no. Let's not be cynical about this. Well, let's look at the cost. Well, here's an example of the cost. I mentioned this company called Weatherspoon, whose boss, Tim Martin, was subject to a 2-minute hate last week because he said that, no, he was not going to close his pubs. And, well, then they were closed for him. The popular pub chain was forced to close after Boris Johnson ordered people to stay at home. 40,000 people worked at his pubs. 40,000 people, and they are out of work at a stroke. In a video message to staff, Martin revealed that Wetherspoon would be relying on a government grant to pay workers. However, this money is not expected to be available until the end of April, leaving staff facing serious financial difficulties in paying rent, bills, and buying groceries. Again, I suppose Boris thinks that the bad old days of the 1970s are gone forever. But, he's going to shut down. He's going to shut down the economy of Britain for at least 3 weeks. And the assumption is, well, he's just going to be able to start it up again, like a car where the engine's been kept warm. Is that the idea? I would not be so sure about that. Not at all. Nigel Farage, the man most responsible for Brexit, has stepped in. And this is really kind of hard to believe, although it's true in my country as well. Brexit Party leader Nigel Farage has criticized Boris Johnson for enforcing a lockdown for 3 weeks to halt the spread of coronavirus, while the UK's borders are still open to foreign travelers. So we are locked down, he tweeted, and a new testing regime will begin. Will the planes keep coming from Milan, Tehran, and Beijing? I expect so. It's all too late. Now, so what is the idea here? Is the idea that tourists are better than regular people, or that businessmen they must get the best treatment? No, you are not allowed to leave your home, and we will sic the police on you. But let's keep taking in people from the worst places in the world in terms of the coronavirus. It's, I could say that I'm surprised, but I'm really not surprised. And I don't know, I've had my difficulties with Peter Hitchens over the years, but I have to say that I'm a great admirer of his now. This is a very brave stand that he has taken. You can go to his Twitter feed, and he has been very active there. He was asked how many old people with serious / severe underlying health problems are there in the UK. He said, I don't know. I do know that the average daily UK death rate in normal circumstances is about 1,600. Obviously higher than that in winter months, lower in spring and autumn. And yeah, here's some data from the United Kingdom. Of those people in ICU wards, 71.7% of them have a body mass index of over 25. Now, however, 66% of the UK population has a body mass index of over 25, which obviously suggests that obesity is a very serious problem. In the United Kingdom, it's a very serious problem pretty much everywhere in the Western world. I was actually genuinely shocked about a decade ago watching a documentary on Scotland to find out the Scots are the fattest people in Europe. I had always, had this traditional view of them as being, rather stick thin. But no, and then I learned about, or was reacquainted with a new Scottish tradition, deep fried Mars bars. No, I am not making that up. I think erosion of liberty in the UK started with the introduction of the temporary income tax. I wonder what new temporary taxes will be introduced to pay for this government's obscene expenditure. Hitchens responds, mainly they will raise savings through inflation by debauching the currency through unaffordable borrowing. Yes. So this is what's happened. It's happened to me, and it's obviously happened much more to Hitchens, that if you are against this panic, then you want people to die. Well, no, actually, I don't. But let's see, someone tweeted Hitchens, so you think that they just happened to die after contracting it, sheer coincidence, and there's a gif of some black person here making a face, you're stupid, because here's a gif of a black person. Hitchens responded, do try to think. I don't know why they died in the absence of autopsy and inquest. Nobody does. But if a very old, ill person with severe heart or respiratory illness dies, it's certainly misleading to blame the event entirely on a virus with which they were infected. Now, Hitchens has pointed to an interview with Professor Dr. Sucharit Bhakti, who is a specialist in infectious medicine. He is one of the most highly cited medical research scientists in Germany. He was head of the Institute for Medical Microbiology at the Johannes Gutenberg Institute of Mainz, one of Germany's most distinguished seats of learning. So he was asked about the coronavirus. What are they? He said these viruses coexist with humans and animals around the globe. They are the cause of very common minor diseases of the respiratory tract. Very often, infections remain subclinical without symptoms. Severe courses occur almost exclusively in elderly patients with other underlying illnesses, in particular of lung and heart. And just to interrupt, as I mentioned, the average age of the patients in the nursing home in North Vancouver, which is responsible for 10 of the 13 coronavirus deaths in my province of British Columbia, is 87. So now, however, a new member of the coronavirus family is on stage spreading fear around the world. Why? The new COVID-19 originated in China and spread rapidly. It appeared to be accompanied by an unexpectedly high number of deaths. Alarming reports followed from northern Italy that concurred with the Chinese experience. It must, however, be pointed out that the large majority of other outbreaks in other parts of the world appear to display lower apparent mortality rates, and such high numbers of 4%, 5%, and 6% were not reached. For example, in South Korea, the apparent mortality rate was 1%. He was asked, why do you say apparent mortality rates? And he responded, when patients concurrently have other illnesses, an infectious agent must not be held solely responsible for a lethal outcome. This happens for COVID-19, but such a conclusion is false and gives rise to the danger that other important factors are overlooked. Different mortality rates may well be due to different local situations. For example, what does northern Italy have in common with China? Answer, horrific air pollution, the highest in the world. Northern Italy is the China of Europe. The lungs of inhabitants there have been chronically injured over decades, and for this simple reason, the situation may not be comparable to elsewhere. What about Germany? The virus has also spread to us. It is spreading in Germany. One most important consequence being that we now have sufficient data to gauge the true nature of the virus in our country. The highest alert level has been proclaimed and extreme preventative measures have been installed in the desperate attempt to retard spread of the virus. Yes, and this is the incredible tragedy, because all these adopted measures are actually senseless. Namely, the pressing questions are answered. The first one, does the virus generally cause more serious illness in young people and kill patients who have no concurring illnesses? This would make them different from other everyday coronaviruses of the world. The answer is simply no. As of March the 18th, there were 10,000 infections reported. 99.5% have no or only mild symptoms. Here we already see that it is false and dangerous to talk about 10,000 patients. They are not seriously ill. Infection is not identical with disease. Of the 10,000 infected people, only 50 to 60 were severely ill, and 30 died to the present day, again, the 18th of March. So we have an apparent mortality rate of 1 COVID-19 positive case per day up till now. The looming worst-case scenario that must be prevented, according to the authorities, is that we would have 1 million cases and maybe 3,000 deaths in 100 days. That would mean 30 deaths a day. The aim is to prevent this worst-case scenario. All current emergency measures aim to slow down virus spread to save lives. And the professor says yes. But we were looking already at the worst-case scenario with 30 deaths a day. 30 deaths a day may sound like very much. Keep in mind that every day, 2,200 over 65-year-olds depart from us here in Germany. How many are not known, so let us just assume 1%, which is surely too low. That would translate to 22 a day, and these die every day. The only difference is that we do not talk about corona deaths because we know that these viruses are normally not the major cause of death. So what we were doing in the moment is to prevent these 22 being replaced by 30 COVID-19 positive patients. This is what is happening. We are afraid that 1 million infections with the new virus will lead to 30 deaths a day over the next 100 days. But we do not realize that 20, 30, or 40, or 100 patients positive for normal coronaviruses are already dying every day. So he's asked what he thinks about the preventative measures, and he says they are grotesque, absurd, and very dangerous. Our elderly citizens have every right to make efforts not to belong to the 2,200 who daily embark on their last journey. Social contacts and social events, theater and music, travel and holiday recreation, sports and hobbies, etc., all help to prolong their stay on Earth. The life expectancy of millions is being shortened. The horrifying impact on the world economy threatens the existence of countless people. The consequences on medical care are profound. Already, services to patients who are in need are reduced, operations canceled, practices empty, hospital personnel dwindling. All this will impact profoundly on our whole society. I can only say that all these measures are leading to self-destruction and collective suicide because of nothing but a spook. Yes, strong words indeed. And I was going to point to, yes, interesting story from PBS NewsHour from December 2017. As many as 646,000 people may die from influenza each year worldwide, according to the latest estimates from the CDC, a larger number than what other health experts had predicted in years past. The Off Guardian, as it's called, has a list of 12 experts questioning the coronavirus panic. We already heard from Dr. Bakti. There's Wolfgang Wodark, who's a German physician specializing in pulmonology. In 2009, he called for an inquiry into alleged conflicts of interest surrounding the EU response to the swine flu pandemic. He says politicians are being courted by scientists who want to be important to get money for their institutions, scientists who just swim along in the mainstream and want their part of it. And what is missing right now is a rational way of looking at things. We should be asking questions like, how did you find out this virus was dangerous? How was it before? Didn't we have the same thing last year? Is it even something new? That's missing. Dr. Joel Kettner, a professor of community health sciences and surgery at Manitoba University, formerly the chief public health officer for the province of Manitoba, says, I've never seen anything like this, anything anywhere near like this. I'm not talking about the pandemic because I've seen 30 of them, one every year. It is called influenza and other respiratory illnesses, viruses. We don't always know what they are, but I've never seen this reaction, and I'm trying to understand why. I worry about the message to the public, about the fear of coming into contact with people, being in the same space as people, shaking their hands, having meetings with people. I worry about many, many consequences related to that. Dr. John Ioannidis, who we were talking about last week, professor of medicine and biomedical data research at Stanford University and a professor of statistics. He says, patients who have been tested for SARS-CoV-2 are disproportionately those with severe symptoms and bad outcomes. As most health systems have limited testing capacity, selection bias may even worsen in the near future. Dr. Yoram Lass, an Israeli physician, politician, and former Director General of the Health Ministry. He says Italy is known for its enormous morbidity in respiratory problems, more than 3 times any other European country. In the US, about 40,000 people die in a regular flu season, and so far 40 to 50 people have died of the coronavirus, most of them in a nursing home in Kirkland, Washington. In every country, more people die from regular flu compared with those who die from the coronavirus. There is a very good example that we all forget, the swine flu in 2009. That was a virus that reached the world from Mexico, and until today, there is no vaccination against it. But what? At that time, there was no Facebook, or there was maybe was, but it was still in its infancy. The coronavirus, in contrast, is a virus with public relations. Whoever thinks that governments end viruses is wrong. Dr. Pietro Bernazza is a Swiss physician at St. Gallen and professor of health policy. He says, we have reliable figures from Italy and a work by epidemiologists, which has been published in the renowned science journal Science, which examined the spread in China. This makes it clear that around 85% of all infections have occurred without anyone noticing the infection. 90% of the deceased patients are verifiably over 70 years old, 50% over 80 years old. If we close the schools, we will prevent the children from quickly becoming immune. Frank Ulrich Montgomery is a German radiologist, former president of the German Medical Association, and deputy chairman of the World Medical Association. He says, I'm not a fan of lockdown. Anyone who imposes something like this must also say when and how to pick it up again. Since we have to assume that the virus will be with us for a long time, I wonder when we will return to normal. You can't keep schools and daycare centers closed until the end of the year, because it will take at least that long until we have a vaccine. Italy has imposed a lockdown and has had the opposite effect. They quickly reached their capacity limits, but did not slow down the virus spread within the lockdown. Professor Hendrik Streeck is a German HIV researcher, epidemiologist, and clinical trialist at Bonn University. He says the new pathogen is not that dangerous. It is even less dangerous than SARS-1. The special thing is that SARS-CoV-2 replicates in the upper throat area and is therefore much more infectious because the virus jumps from throat to throat, so to speak. But that is also an advantage. Because SARS-1 replicates in the deep lungs, it is not so infectious, but it definitely gets on the lungs, which makes it more dangerous. You also have to take into account that the SARS-CoV-2 deaths in Germany were exclusively old people. In Heinsberg, for example, a 78-year-old man with previous illnesses died of heart failure, and that without his SARS-2 lung involvement. Since he was infected, he naturally appears in the COVID-19 statistics. But the question is whether he would have not died anyway, even without SARS-2. Dr. Yanis Roussel says the problem of SARS-CoV-2 is probably overestimated, as 2.6 million people die of respiratory infections each year, compared with less than 4,000 deaths for SARS-CoV-2 at the time of writing. And Dr. David Katz, the founding director of the Yale University Prevention Research Center, says, I'm deeply concerned that the social, economic, and public health consequences of this near total meltdown of public life, schools and businesses closed, gatherings banned, will be long-lasting and calamitous, probably graver than the direct toll of the virus itself. The stock market will bounce back in time, but many businesses never will. The unemployment, impoverishment, and despair likely to result will be public health scourges of the first order. Michael Osterholm is Regents Professor and Director of the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy at the University of Minnesota. He says, consider the effect of shutting down offices, schools, transportation systems, restaurants, hotels, stores, theaters, concert halls, sporting events, and other venues indefinitely, and leaving all of their workers unemployed and on the public dole. The likely result would be not just a depression, but a complete economic breakdown with countless permanently lost jobs long before a vaccine is ready or natural immunity takes hold. Dr. Peter Goetsche, professor of clinical research design at the University of Copenhagen, says, our main problem is that no one will ever get in trouble for measures that are too draconian. They will only get in trouble if they do too little. So our politicians and those working with public health do much more than they should do. No such draconian measures were applied during the 2009 influenza pandemic, and they obviously cannot be applied every winter, which is all year round, as it is always winter somewhere. We cannot close down the whole world permanently. Well, yes, of course. And as I mentioned yesterday, public parks are being closed. The whole point of a park is that it's a replication of nature. Only it's in the city. People go to parks so they can be alone in the city, that they're not surrounded by people. Obviously, the chances of transmitting communicable disease to other people in parks is far less than it is, on city streets, restaurants, or whatever. When parks are being closed, this suggests to me an element of sadism. There's no other way that I can describe this. Let's see. Let's look at the chat again. 50% of gold is Indian dowries and jewelry. No, says Coacha Lango. That's my understanding. Back when I used to write about gold on a regular basis, I forget what time of the year it is, but there's an Indian wedding season, which is in effect the gold season. Chad Chatson says, I checked several websites for silver rounds and came up empty. Brandon Smith says, still people out there sitting on $40 an ounce silver from '08. Bet they're glad they'd HODL'd now. Yeah. I just want to say about these draconian measures that let's force people into total social isolation and fill them with panic and as much as possible prevent them from getting exercise. Do you think that might be the combination there? Might be immunosuppressive? I can't read Chinese characters, but someone says, how come China's economy could afford looking down all this time? No Wall Street collapsing markets. Now they're slowly restarting factories and businesses that had shut down. Is China more resilient? There seems to be, there's data coming out of China, with regarding to how many cars are on the road, that sort of thing. We know that the Chinese are manic about Keynesianism. As I mentioned before, you can search the Daily Mail for China ghost cities, and you will see entire cities built to house 1 million people with all the apartment buildings and all the rest of the infrastructure. It's all there, and they are empty. And so they do things differently in China than they do elsewhere. Our Chinese friend says, I've been in contact with people in China through friends and work and also online friends. Job security was never a problem from what I know. When businesses reopen, they say they will have the same employees before lockdown. Great Lakes Nationalist says, years ago, Scotland was notorious for high per capita heart disease, just as Finland was notorious for alcoholism. Many Koreans are impressed by China's ability to mobilize economy and the state to get things done. No political bickering we've had. Well, lots of politicians all over the world are jealous of the prerogatives of Chinese leaders. But, we're supposed to be about liberty. And it turns out, at least among all those people screaming for panic, and more panic, or you're in favor of killing people, it turns out that they've just been lying about it all these years because they don't give a toss about liberty. Not at all. This is interesting. Maybe this is Korean fellow. Many right-wing Koreans are nostalgic for the Park Chung-hee days when dissidents were jailed. South Korea used to get things done back then. Now we have cults filling the role of the state. It's funny, when Steve Saylor's written about this, you see these Korean protests. One is really impressed by how organized and efficient it is. And, they come there wearing their riot gear. They got their protective masks on against tear gas. Their signs are obviously, professionally printed. And then, I don't know. I mean, Korea is not considered particularly interesting in the West for some reason. I suspect it's probably just as interesting or more interesting than China. It's curious to me. Korea is a small country, which is, of course, cut in two, sadly. But Korea has a number of brands that are known around the world. Hyundai, Kia, Samsung, LG, which they say stands for Life's Good, but actually stands for Lucky Gold Star. And what are the Chinese brands that anyone knows about? I suppose there's Huawei. That's the company that wants to spy on the whole world through its phone system. Brendan Smith says corralling the free-range chickens into their permanent coops requires a generational strategic approach. Caxel Rose says if you actually produce things, you are more resilient. Well, yeah. Yes, exactly. that people in the United States, people in Canada, people everywhere in the West, even cheesemakers in France, as we learned from Michel Houellebecq's latest novel, have been told, no, 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 you don't want to make cheese anymore. Oh, do the French even need to make wine? There places that will produce cheaper wine, cheaper cheese. There's always a place that will produce something cheaper. If that means that your culture is destroyed as a result, what is that compared to growing world GDP? Now, they never talk, of course, about how that GDP is divided up. Apparently, that part of the equation is irrelevant. Dr. Bruce Charlton has some very interesting things to say. He begins with a quote from, what I consider to be a remarkable book by G.K. Chesterton called The Man Who Was Thursday from 1908. Syme could only feel an unnatural buoyancy in his body and a crystal simplicity in his mind that seemed to be superior to everything that he said or did. But he felt he was in possession of some impossible good news which made every other thing a triviality, but an adorable triviality. That's how I felt this morning, as if buoyed by an impossible, indeed ridiculous and paradoxical upwelling of good news, evidence of a pretty large and positive change in my perspective, living more here and now and in the divine presence, no longer living so much in the past and the future. As I said earlier, that's how I felt today. I just felt that this madness is going to end because it is unsustainable. The only question is, how much wreckage will there be? Some people who think that this is going to kill off globalism, some people think that this is going to lead to the final triumph of globalism. But in an age when so many people are unemployed, just forget about the unemployment numbers in the United States because they're phony, because they don't count people who have given up looking for work. And that is over 90 million people. So you have, over 100 million people unemployed and a great many who are underemployed. And now you're telling them that you can't even have, what little you have now. Nope. Because there's a strain of influenza out there. Wait a minute. Doesn't that happen every year? Yeah, but this is different. We're not seeing it in the numbers. This is different. What are you? Some sort of traitor? I mentioned on Twitter today that listening to these people, it's like hearing a Stalinist, back in the day, bleating about kulaks and wreckers and right deviationists. So Dr. Charlton says, how far will this be taken? I would assume that the global establishment want to take their collapse just to that point where they have achieved the maximum power by means of their currently favored mechanisms of omni-surveillance, total control, and the domination of a single bureaucracy. But such would necessarily be a high-tech, highly organized modern dystopia. Whereas if things go much further in the direction of collapse, high-tech and organization will be among the first casualties and likely impossible to restore. This is an aspect yet to emerge, yet to become clear. Will this global collapse stop short of destroying the infrastructure of global governance, or will it continue beyond that point? Is this of the nature of an intended reset, or is it an all-consuming apocalyptic outcome that is planned? Reboot or revelations? Yeah, that's a very good question. Again, I'll go back to the front page of the New York Times website. Trump isn't listening to the experts. Sometimes it's just like some dystopian film where you hear a klaxon. What? Sector 7G. Someone is not listening to an expert. Someone has doubted expert opinion. We're on it, boss. So Dr. Charlton writes, a stato is a number cruncher, derogatively, someone who sees life through the stats rather than using stats to understand life. Statos have been a near lethal plague in medicine, especially in the form of evidence-based medicine. And in and around when I was an epidemiology lecturer, 1993 to 1996, I produced a stream of papers and talks to explain the dangers of statistically minded people pretending that what they did was science and that their type of expertise trumped that of those with substantive knowledge, such as doctors. I completely failed, no surprise. And we now live in stato world, where people with some kind of numerical expertise are regarded as experts on everything, especially so regarded by themselves. What's that fellow's name? Nate Silver, the 538 guy? He would seem to be the king of the statos, isn't he? That guy, he knows everything that's going to happen. He can tell you what who's going to win a football game in progress, down to, fraction of a decimal point, supposedly, except when he's wrong, Anyway, Dr. Charlton continues, in scientific reality, a world that has all but disappeared, statistics are used almost entirely to clarify by summary a large quantity of data so that it can be grasped and understood by somebody who understands the subject. But when somebody does not understand the subject, and especially when they are not truly interested in knowing the truth about it, but have some other agenda, they make truly immense mistakes with total confidence and a stubborn inability to acknowledge their errors. Truthful knowledge of a subject is what lets us know what numbers are relevant to an issue and what, the vast bulk of them, are not relevant. Shall I give you an example? It relates to the current birdemic. Given that the death rate is so very low and the bodies stubbornly refuse to pile up, the entire rationale for the global totalitarian takeover is to stop the limited supply of intensive therapy facilities being overwhelmed. Yet the birdemic is lethal almost only to the old and infirm, especially the very old and or very infirm, and such people would not, in normal good medical practice, be put into ITUs on ventilators because their time has come. We will all die, and most of us would prefer a good death, but ventilated death under IT is a bad death. Bad for the patient and the family and loved ones. It is also futile, as confirmed by eyewitness accounts that almost everybody puts onto a ventilator for the birdemic dies anyway. Assuming these reports really are facts, which I don't know for sure because so much of the truth is being withheld and spun, there is not going to be a shortage of rare intensive therapy facilities unless such a shortage is artificially created by treating people who would not and should not be treated under normal conditions of humane medical practice. Also, pragmatically, if in an insane world, multiply sick people with upper respiratory tract infections were to be routinely treated, all the ITU facilities in the world always would be full all of the time and would never treat anyone who might benefit, because URTI in the elderly and multiply sick is probably the commonest acute cause of death in the world. My point is that by a couple of relevant facts whose relevance is not appreciated by statos make all the difference in the world. Even these facts aren't really heeded if we take the birdemic at face value and notice the simple stat that it has killed a small proportion of almost entirely old sick people, even in the worst case scenarios like on board that cruise boat. But none of this makes any difference in stato world. And since this crisis is in fact a spiritual war in which everyone is being compelled to take sides, we can see that, with some notable exceptions such as William Briggs, who is anyway not, by my definition, a stato. The statos have ended up on the wrong side, fighting on the side of wrong. Well, yes, again, if something good were to come out of coronavirus, well, there's all sorts of good things that could come out of this. Perhaps the tyranny of the experts could be overthrown, because as I continue to point out, they are routinely, outrageously wrong about everything, almost continuously. Oh, yes, it's the end of history. Oh, we're just going to be so bored. We're all going to be suffering from affluenza. Every so-called smart person in the world believed that. And then 2008 happened. And did we learn anything from that? No. I mentioned boss Jim Geddes, and apparently we're going to need, from Citizen Kane, apparently we're going to need more than one lesson. Okay. Scott Reed is now one of my heroes. Actually, I've interviewed Scott Reed many times. He has been an MP, Canadian MP, since 2000. He's written several books. He is quite a thoughtful man, which is not something that one could say about very many of Canada's members of Parliament. Well, he is public enemy number one now in Canada, at least to the elite, because he refused to give consent for a motion that required unanimous consent. And so why would he do that? Okay. He said, before I deny unanimous consent to the motion which will be introduced in the House of Commons today, I think I have to go into the public record explaining my reasons for denying my consent to the motion. Moreover, I need to explain why I turned up in the House of Commons at all today, despite a request from the whips of all parties that their members stay away from the House of Commons, and notwithstanding the Prime Minister's admonishment that Canadians go home and stay home. The second explanation will follow after I have dealt with the first item. Can you believe this? No, don't come to the House of Commons, that we're just going to legislate without you. You know, can we just drop the pretense that the government of Canada has anything to do with liberty or freedom? Scott Reed continues, on Friday, March the 13th, a motion was adopted by unanimous consent in the House of Commons, along with a series of non-objectionable measures, which were enumerated in the motion as items A through P. The motion included two provisions which are blatantly unconstitutional. These provisions caused the House of Commons to adopt bills that had not yet been given what we call first reading. First reading, second reading, third reading, approval by the Senate, then signing into law. No. That takes too long. So we're not going to do that anymore. As Reed explains, in other words, the House adopted bills that it had not actually seen and whose contents were therefore unknown to the members of the House. More colloquially, the House agreed to buy a pig in a poke, or more correctly, several pigs in a poke, since more than one bill was thereby enacted. So, here are the offending provisions of the motion. The motions to concur in supplementary estimates for the fiscal year ending on March 31, 2020, and interim supply for the fiscal year ending March 31, 2021, be adopted on division, and the appropriation bills based thereon be deemed to have been introduced and read a first time, deemed read a second time, and referred to a committee of the whole on division, and deemed considered in committee of the whole, deemed reported without amendment, deemed concurred at report stage on division, deemed read a third time, and passed on division. This is just absolutely breathtaking. And here is F. A bill in the name of the Minister of Finance entitled An Act to Amend the Financial Administration Act, Special Warrant, be deemed to have been introduced. As you can see, these provisions cause acts which could, notwithstanding their limited sounding titles, contain a wide variety of measures which might not have been met with the approval of the House, had the House been given the opportunity to inspect them. This would not have been a problem if the appropriate minister had engaged in first reading of each of the bills and then given the House adequate time to inspect the contents to ensure that they were acceptable. Deeming acceptance at all later stages of a bill is something that is done as a matter of course. But you can't even tell from the wording of provisions D and F that 3 bills are actually being approved rather than only 2. I do not deny that the COVID-19 crisis had by the 13th induced widespread panic among the public in Canada and abroad. But panic is never, ever an excuse to override our ancient political conventions. And he explains that conventions mean accepted practices that override the formal rules, whatever those nominal rules might happen to be. These conventions are the oldest and best protections that exist for our political liberties. But there is no guarantee that the government has learned its lesson. Indeed, if we are to take our signs from the first draft of Bill C-13, which is to be introduced today and which was leaked last night, it would appear that the government's primary interest is using the COVID-19 crisis to strip away any parliamentary oversight whatever between now and December 21, 21 months in the future and long after the health crisis is likely to have come to an end. He asks himself why I cannot obey an illegal order to stay away from the Commons. I can only exercise my right to deny unanimous consent if I am present in the House of Commons at the moment when that consent is sought. Therefore, the only credible rationale, as far as I can see, for a deal between the Liberals and the other parties, under the terms of which MPs were ordered to stay away from the House of Commons, is to make sure that each of the abstaining or absenting MPs would thereby be deprived of his or her ability to say no. The ability of which, of course, is the whole reason why the unanimous consent rule exists in the first place. This is precisely why our predecessors, about a century, well, he's talking about after Henry VIII, adopted the rule that the most precious of all privileges appertaining to MPs is the right to participate in the proceedings of the House of Commons unimpeded by the King's men or anybody else. But a convention that dates back to the time of Robert Walpole and King George I, the Prime Minister wields in practice all of the powers of the monarch. He is, in essence, what the Greeks of Aristotle's time would have described as an elective monarch. This must mean that the Prime Minister also takes on all the obligations of the monarch, including the obligation to never impede MPs from attending to the business of the House. And then he adds a final note to address the red herring that it is dangerous for MPs to travel to Ottawa in the plague year. We MPs were given a series of nonsensical arguments about why we must not, in the present crisis, attend to our duties. One of these arguments was that MPs cannot safely travel to the nation's capital from the ridings scattered across the land because this would cause them to be on airplanes where they might catch COVID-19 from an asymptomatic carrier or else become carriers themselves. This seemed instinctively wrong to me. Is it too dangerous to have MPs sit next to each other in the House of Commons? In that case, as one fellow Conservative MP pointed out to me, we could rent the Ottawa Convention Centre and hold our emergency sitting there. What about the danger of MPs sitting on flights to and from Ottawa? Well, to start with, if this is such a critical health risk, why are we allowing commercial flights to continue from one Canadian city to another? Are the lives of MPs sacred and those of ordinary Canadians inconsequential? Either it is too dangerous for anyone to fly and all domestic flights should be shut down at once, or it is not, and MPs should be permitted to fly too. But the government hasn't suggested shutting down all domestic flights, and the opposition hasn't called on the government to do so. So, 3 cheers for Scott Reid. Canadians are looking for retribution against this man. Boycott Giant Tiger is trending on Twitter. According to Wikipedia, Giant Tiger Stores Limited is a Canadian discount store chain which operates over 250 stores across Canada. The chain employs about 8,000 people. And the founder of this company it was a man called Gordon Reid, who is, guess what, Scott Reid's father. And Scott Reid is involved in the management of Giant Tiger. He has never denied otherwise. I mean, I knew about this a couple of decades ago. It's not exactly a secret, but people on Twitter are acting as if it had been a secret. And so they are determined to hurt Scott Reid, perhaps by putting 8,000 people out of work, you know? So what the latest, yes, the Liberal government drops language that would have granted taxing powers to 2021, but the Tories are still concerned. Yes, it's rather similar to what's going on in the United States, where Trump wants a relief bill, and the Democrats want to add all this pork, also gender stuff, funding for Planned Parenthood, etc. Whereas in Canada, the Conservatives want a relief bill, and apparently the Trudeau government wants to launch a coup and have Justin Trudeau, whose father, of course, is long rumored to be Fidel Castro. Of course, Justin Trudeau would become a caudillo, as they say in Latin America. So, What's the latest? MPs suspend Parliament for hours after opposition rejects proposed new government powers. This is a minority government that the Liberals have. And I guess it is an example of the extraordinary chutzpah of these people that they are throwing their weight around or attempting to throw their weight around at a time when, of course, they are weak. That is to say, they lack a majority. So I guess one way to get around lacking a majority is to have the ability to pass legislation without votes. Yeah, that's one way to get around it. Let's see. Althea Raj, who I believe written a book about Trudeau. She's with the Huffington Post. She's the Ottawa bureau chief there. In this book about Justin Trudeau, which is quite laudatory, she mentioned a rather extraordinary thing, or at least it was extraordinary to me, that when Justin Trudeau was living in Vancouver and teaching at a private school, he invited a grade 12 student, a male, to be his guest at his place at Whistler for a weekend. Is that normally what teachers do? It's my understanding that it is not. But she reported this. She reported this on Huffington Post, and one would have thought that eyebrows would have been raised. My eyebrow was certainly raised, but oh, he's just so dreamy. Well, according to Ms. Raj, Donald Trump may be focused on restarting the American economy, but Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says his government's objective is to keep people alive and healthy. Yeah, by forcing them into isolation and killing jobs. Yeah, that's exactly. And filling them with panic. In his daily national address from outside of his home, where he remains in self-isolation after his wife, Sophie Gregoire Trudeau, contracted COVID-19, the Canadian leader suggested the two neighboring countries are charting different courses. I'd like to hear more about Mrs. Trudeau, especially, is it true that they separated about 4 months ago? There's also the interesting datum that she gave Idris Elba the coronavirus. And then this might have been passed on to the former Prime Minister of Australia. What's her name? Julia Gillard, I believe. We are continuing in Canada to base our decisions and our recommendations and our guidelines to Canadians on science, Trudeau said. Our priority is keeping Canadians alive and healthy, and this is what we will continue to focus on in Canada. Trudeau's words rang in sharp contrast to Trump, who earlier this week tweeted he was giving social distancing and self-isolation measures, which have shut down businesses across the country, 15 days to work before reevaluating their impact. Oh, no, you got to do this forever, or at least for 18 months, or everyone is dead of starvation, or, has killed each other fighting over, the last can of beans. It's got to last forever. You've got to stay the course, people. The World Health Organization on Tuesday said the U.S. has the potential to become the new epicenter of the pandemic due to a large acceleration of infections of the highly contagious respiratory virus. Some people are going to get sick, the president acknowledged during his television interview, but the current situation is worse, he claimed. You're going to have suicides by the thousands, Trump said. You're going to have instability. Americans will get depressed, and that causes death and other problems, the president explained. Small business owners don't want to be locked up at home. They want to be saving their businesses. And I'll just break in to say that, again, I walk down my street, and I see all these different kinds of businesses, a stereo store, high-end stereo store, dry cleaner, various restaurants, all these businesses closed. And again, I wonder how many of them are going to return after this madness is over. Let's see. Yeah, this is just Trudeau good, Orange man bad. That's the story. People are coming to Pearson Airport from around the world, and no one's doing anything with them. It's just come on home. Maybe you're sick. maybe you're not. We don't care. That is the attitude. Oh, shutting down flights, that would be racist and that would induce stigma, and we can't have that. And I promised yesterday, I didn't keep the promise, but I would keep it now, that I would talk about a man called Athanasius Schneider, who is a Catholic bishop. It's a very interesting life, and I'll read a little bit from the Wikipedia entry. He was born in 1961 in Tokmak, Kyrgyz SSR in the Soviet Union. His parents were Black Sea Germans from Odessa in the Ukraine. After the Second World War, they were sent by Stalin to a gulag in Krasnokamsk in the Ural Mountains. There, the family was closely involved with the underground church. Schneider's mother, Maria, was one of several women who helped shelter the Blessed Oleksa Zarekchi, a Ukrainian priest who would later be imprisoned in the infamous Karlag by the Soviet regime for his ministry. He would eventually be martyred in 1963. The family traveled to the Kyrgyz SSR after being released from the camps. Later, they left Central Asia for Estonia. As a boy, Schneider and his three siblings would attend clandestine masses with their parents, often traveling 60 miles from the family's home in Valga to Tartu, taking the first train in the morning under the cover of darkness and returning with the last train at night. Due to the great distance and frequent visits by the clergy and crackdowns by the Soviet authorities, they were able to make the trip only once a month. In 1973, shortly after making his first Holy Communion in secret, Schneider emigrated with his family to Rottweil in West Germany. So you can see just from this that obviously the Mass and Holy Communion mean a great deal to Bishop Schneider. So he entered a Catholic religious order in 1982. He was consecrated a bishop in 2006, and in 2011, he was transferred to the position of auxiliary bishop in the Archdiocese of Astana. He is the General Secretary of the Bishops' Conference of Kazakhstan. He speaks German, Russian, Portuguese, Spanish, English, French, and Italian, and he reads Latin and Ancient Greek. He has criticized clergy members whom he believes do not fully adhere to the faith and who surrender instead to what he calls a cruel pagan world. In 2014, he compared them to members of the clergy and even bishops who put grains of incense in front of the statue of the emperor or of a pagan idol, or who delivered the books of Holy Scripture to be burned. He alleged that even in the present age, there are traitors to the faith. A traditionalist Catholic, Schneider supports the posture of receiving Holy Communion on the tongue while kneeling in the liturgy, which is the subject of his book, Dominus Est. Let's see. Yes, he's very old school, apparently. He has vigorously upheld the traditional teaching of the Church that divorce and remarriage outside of it constitutes adultery, a mortal sin, therefore making one ineligible to receive Holy Communion. In a 2014 interview, he said that calls for change to this practice came from anti-Christian media. He suggested it was a false concept of mercy, saying it is comparable to a doctor who gives a diabetic patient sugar, although he knows it will kill him. He has even gone so far as to say that the Church needs a new syllabus, that is actually referring to the syllabus of errors. And Syllabus of Errors was an encyclical by the Pope Pius IX of holy memory, part of the war on modernism. Up until Second Vatican Council, all priests, when they were ordained, had to swear an oath against modernism and to condemn all of the heresies of modernism. Of course, many of these heresies have subsequently been adopted or at least, ignored by the Catholic Church. There is a piece from him on lifesitenews.com, a website that I highly recommend. And the question is how to go on living when masses are suspended. He declared that the entire human race has become a kind of prisoner of a world sanitary dictatorship. He writes, and he quotes Romans 5:3, we glory in tribulations. Millions of Catholics in the so-called free Western world will, in the coming weeks or even months, and especially during Holy Week and Easter, the culmination of the entire liturgical year, be deprived of any public acts of worship due to both civic and ecclesiastical reaction to the outbreak of coronavirus. The most painful and distressing of these is the deprivation of Holy Mass and sacramental Holy Communion. The current atmosphere of an almost planetary panic is continuously fueled by the universally proclaimed dogma of the new coronavirus pandemic. The drastic and disproportionate security measures with the denial of fundamental human rights of freedom of movement, freedom of assembly, and freedom of opinion appear almost globally orchestrated along a precise plan. Thus, the entire race becomes a kind of prisoner of a world sanitary dictatorship, which for its part also reveals itself as a political dictatorship. An important side effect of this new sanitary dictatorship that is spreading throughout the world is the growing and an uncompromising ban on all forms of public worship. Beginning on March 16th, the German government issued a ban on all forms of public religious gatherings for all religions. Such a drastic measure of strict prohibition of all forms of public worship was unimaginable even during the Third Reich. Before these measures were taken in Germany, a governmentally ordered prohibition of any public worship was implemented in Italy and Rome, the heart of Catholicism and of Christianity. The current situation of the prohibition of public worship in Rome brings the Church back to the time of analogous prohibition issued by the pagan Roman emperors in the first centuries. Clerics who dare to celebrate Holy Mass in the presence of the faithful in such circumstances could be punished or put in prison. The world sanitary dictatorship has created a situation which breathes the air of the catacombs, of a persecuted church, of an underground church, especially in Rome. Pope Francis, who on March 15th, with lonely and halting steps, walked through the deserted streets of Rome on his pilgrimage from the image of the Salus Populi Romani in the church of Santa Maria Maggiore to the miraculous cross in the church of San Marcello, conveyed an apocalyptic image. It was reminiscent of the following description of the third part of The Secret of Fatima, revealed on 13th July 1917, quote, "The Holy Father passed through a big city half in ruins and half trembling with halting step, afflicted with pain and sorrow," unquote. I should mention that the so-called third secret of Our Lady of Fatima was never been revealed, despite what the Vatican said. And I've talked to people who have actually read it. It refers to the Vatican turning against Christ itself. Various popes had seen it. It was supposed to be released in the 1960s, and various popes decided that it was too terrifying to be released. So a cover story was released when John Paul II was pope, and Cardinal Ratzinger was his enforcer. The cover story, I won't go into it. It refers to a pope being shot, something like that. Why this was so terrifying, this had to be kept secret, for decades. Obviously, it's a phony story. I mean, the Pope, John Paul II, he was stabbed by a Turk. So the bishop writes, how should Catholics react and behave in such a situation? We have to accept this situation from the hands of divine providence as a trial, which will bring us a greater spiritual benefit than if we had not experienced such a situation. One can understand this situation as a divine intervention in the current unprecedented crisis of the Church. God uses now the merciless world sanitary dictatorship to purify the Church, to awaken the responsible in the Church, and in first place the Pope and the Episcopate, from the illusion of a nice modern world, from the temptation to flirt with the world, from the immersion in temporal and earthly things. The powers of this world have now forcibly celebrated the faithful from their shepherds. The clergy is ordered by governments to celebrate liturgy without the people. This current purifying divine intervention has the power to show all of us what is truly essential in the Church, the Eucharistic sacrifice of Christ, with his body and blood and the eternal salvation of immortal souls. May those in the Church who are unexpectedly and suddenly deprived of what is central start to see and appreciate its value more deeply. Now, as I've mentioned several times on this live stream, Christians have been celebrating Easter for almost 2,000 years, and apparently this year we're not going to be allowed to celebrate it. And our faith leaders, as they are called, don't seem particularly put out about this. Hey, you can do this on the internet. Well, you can do everything on the internet. There's no need to get together with people. There's no need for churches. There's no need for communion. So why does the church exist? Seriously, if that's what they believe, why are they there? Well, I know why they're there, because the church is run by traitors and has been for decades. But why the laity should put up with this is astonishing. There is another piece on this subject from Rorata Caeli, from an Italian priest, Richard Gennaro Cipolla. Traditional Catholics in the enforced desert, dare we enter? A short while ago, I wrote a piece on how we can use the situation in which we Catholics find ourselves because of the Corona-19 virus pandemic to deepen our Catholic faith. In many parts of the world, we find ourselves in the unprecedented situation where the faithful cannot attend Mass and therefore cannot receive Holy Communion. I tried, perhaps too subtly, in my previous article to suggest that this situation in which we find ourselves is an opportunity to deepen our Catholic faith and our understanding of the Blessed Sacrament. And I still believe this and urge everyone to take advantage of this time of deprivation of the Mass and of reception of Holy Communion to deepen our Catholic faith. But to urge Catholics to do this and not point out what is in the way of this deepening of our faith in these times of pandemic and cancellation of all public Masses and mirabile dictu, cancellation of public celebrations of Holy Week and Easter, would be a pastoral dereliction. As a priest, this is not only an objective situation that causes me astonishment and personal grief, it also forces me to dig deeper into my faith, my Catholic faith, yes, to try to understand, albeit through a glass darkly, yet trying to understand what this means for the Church and for the faithful, what it means for our faith. The current situation has exposed a quasi-paradox. The faithful, for the most part, accept the reasons for the suppression of public Masses, namely that such proximity of people in a relatively small space would contribute to the spread of the coronavirus. What I would call the typical Novus Ordo Catholics, whose experience of the Mass is only that which came about after the imposition of the Novus Ordo Mass by Paul VI, is not fazed by the lifting of the precept of obligation to attend Mass on Sundays and holy days of obligation. What must be added here is that the number of Catholics attending Sunday Mass has fallen dramatically since the Novus Ordo was introduced. This data is accepted by all as objective, and the question can be asked whether, if the legal precept of the Church were nullified, how many Catholics would indeed come to Sunday Mass. I'll just point out here that, speaking of great ironies, the Novus Ordo, or so-called New Order of Mass, which was imposed illegally on the Church in 1970, and well, more to the point, the old Mass, the Tridentine Mass, the Mass of Pope St. Pius V, was illegally suppressed. It was 50 years old a few days ago, and it appears to have met its goal in eliminating Catholic worship. That is to say, there were no celebrations of this wonderful so-called new Mass. The father writes, the surprising and to me ironical opposition to the cancellation of public Masses has come mainly from what we call traditional Catholics. That term must be parsed into its many conjugations and tenses, but the outcry comes mainly from those who see this as a denial of their right to receive Holy Communion at Mass. The deep and almost comical irony of this situation must not be lost on God. God's appreciation of irony with respect to mankind is part of his infinite love for us. One can much more easily explain the lack of opposition from the great majority of Catholics who regularly attend the Novus Ordo Mass. If they feel discomfited by the present situation, it is not because they feel deprived of the opportunity to assist at the holy sacrifice of the Mass, which is for the Catholic the sublime act of the worship of God. For most of them have no idea that the Mass is a sacrifice and that their presence at the Mass is to assist in the deepest sense the priest, not the minister, but the priest who offers sacrifice in the offering of the Son to the Father, the offering of Good Friday, but in an unbloody way, for the living and the dead, for themselves and all they love, living and the dead. So, as I say, the Second Vatican Council started in 1962. I was in Catholic school at the time. I'm 7 years old. You may have heard that Pope John the 23rd, who was the one who had the idea for, springtime aggiornamento, that he was just so beloved. Well, my experience was a little different because he died when I was a pupil at a Catholic school, and the priests and nuns were sad. But I tell you, when Kennedy died, sometime later, shortly thereafter, the grief was overwhelming. The priests and the nuns were stricken, and it was like chalk and cheese, comparing it to the reaction to the death of Pope John the 23rd. But the church has been in a crisis since 1962. Oh, by the way, this may be apocryphal, but it is widely believed that John the 23rd's dying words in 1963 were "Stop the Council." Well, it wasn't stopped, and went on until 1965 under Pope Pius, the next Pope, and Pius VI, and it instituted a crisis which continues to this day. And so I've wondered about this for decades, actually, that when is this going to end? And, well, as Pope Paul VI, of course. I don't know what led me to say Pope Pius. But when is it going to end? And a while ago, I got the impression, I don't know, a decade ago, that it's never going to end. It's going to last forever. If you look at the crisis, involving Saint Athanasius, how long that lasted? Well, this is longer than that, or so it seems, at any rate. And then Francis became Pope, and I thought, okay, apparently it's going to end pretty quickly now, and it's going to end with the vanishing of the visible church. We are promised that the church will not vanish from this earth. That's the promise that Jesus gave to Peter. But we are not told in what form it will survive. So long as there is a single bishop in the world, just one, the Catholic Church survives. And is that the direction in which we are going? Again, okay, we're going to cancel all the masses voluntarily because people might get sick. Oh, but what about the people that we venerate as saints because of their ministry to the sick, which led to their own deaths? That was olden times, And anyway, miracles, seriously? But no, it's, as I say, it's just extraordinary times in which we live. And the reference to the third secret of Fatima, I think, is most appropriate. So from sacred to profane, I guess I want to talk a little about last night's episode of Better Call Saul. Well, a week previously, Jimmy, aka Saul Goodman, he was the sensible one, and it seemed like Kim Wexler was going over the edge. Everything was topsy-turvy last night. That Kim seemed to have settled down, but Jimmy was determined to make a point in the inimitable Jimmy fashion. He was a regular old-time Hollywood mogul, like a Daryl F. Zanuck. He's a writer, he's a producer, he's a director. And I always like the Better Call Saul episodes where the drama kids are involved, although I've noticed in recent episodes that the female member of that trio is rather excessively tanned, I must say. But it's funny, I've been reading the reviews by Donna Bowman at the AV Club. Truth to tell, for a number of years, I spent a great deal of time at the AV Club reading the reviews and reading the comments. But it's become so woke that it is, I just pretty much have stopped reading it. It's just unbearable. They can't mention any, particularly when they're talking about some, older film, Oh, apparently this film is transphobic. Oh, it's transphobic, and how is that? Well, there's a man in a dress. Okay, and let me guess. So there's a man in a dress, and people are laughing at him because it's a man in a dress. Yeah, that's pretty shocking stuff. And so the episode last night called Wexler versus Goodman began with a flashback, a bit of history, when we see Kim when she's a little girl and she's studying the cello and she is waiting to be picked up. Apparently, she's been waiting a long time. There's no one else there. And we see a car coming from some distance, and it's clear that who's ever driving this car should not be driving the car. And it turns out it's Kim's mother. And she is 3 sheets to the wind, though she insists that she only had a single beer. And little Kim says, well, it doesn't smell like it. And they get into an argument, and Kim decides to walk home 3 miles. And I guess the point is that she's a tough nut. That's we're supposed to take that away from it. Also, that that she has worked hard to get where she is. It's odd in this review that we are supposed to think that Kim Wexler is somehow hard done by at her law firm, because it seems to me that Rich Schweikert has treated her with nothing but kindness. Her sloughing off work on subordinates while she does pro bono stuff, I can't really think of many law firms of any size that would permit such a thing to happen. She has endangered the Mesa Verde account, which was the reason why she was brought into Schweikert's law firm on several occasions. And Schweikert has figured out that she's been running a scam on him. And last week, she started shouting at him in the foyer of the office, that he was acting outrageously and how dare he, etc., etc. So I just Donna Bowman seems to take the position that, poor Kim, and I'm thinking, no, I'm just losing a lot of sympathy for this woman. She seems to be determined to make herself unhappy. And I guess, what can you do? What can you do? She crashed a car and broke her arm because she couldn't handle the pressure. Maybe she should leave the law profession. Oh, a lot of people do. But Jimmy, of course, he's a criminal lawyer, and a criminal lawyer, of course, as Jesse Pinkman said, and one at times has a certain admiration for his guile and his showmanship. But again, we just saw last night he was just a dink, an absolute dink. That Chuck Hamlin, tried to make amends for Jimmy's brother's behavior and seemed to be, quite hurt by what had been happened to Jimmy. And he offered him a job, serious offer. And so what does Jimmy do? Well, he seriously vandalizes his car, and then he pays 2 prostitutes. And, I'm not talking high-end prostitutes. I'm talking about street hookers to go up to Chuck at lunch in a Tony establishment and complain that he owes them money, because he's the sort of person who obviously consorts with street prostitutes. And of course, I suppose, what did Nietzsche call it? The slave mentality? That there are certain people who insist on biting the hand that feeds them. And I suppose Jimmy is one of those people. It just seemed appalling all the way around. Of course, the ending of the episode was really quite a shock, which tells me more than anything else that that Kim has lost it. Now, people were calling out the performance of Rhea Seehorn, and I have to agree, she's really extraordinarily good. And we should be grateful for the long form dramatic TV because it gives an opportunity for character actors and actresses to showcase their craft. I don't mean to be dismissive, with the use of the term character actor, because in America, in Hollywood, character actors are the real actors, because it's not expected that leading men and women be any good at acting. I mean, if they are, it's a bonus. I heard it said once of Arnold Schwarzenegger that he's more than an actor, he is a star. And there's a long tradition of this. I mean, John Wayne was in a similar position, but of course, John Ford, who had sort of a love-hate relationship with John Wayne over many decades, he saw Wayne in what I think Rio Bravo, and supposedly he said, "Nobody told me the son of a bitch could act." So, I've always loved character actors, and I love the fact that they're getting an opportunity to strut their stuff. The people who are put forward as leading men and leading ladies in movies now are, for the most part, mannequins, and not even particularly attractive ones, because they have the uncanny valley effect. Also, they represent, as the kids like to say, younger and younger with each passing year. I recall that show with Kevin Spacey, the remake of the much better British House of Cards, where this reporter who rumbles him, I'm just looking at her and thinking, all her bits are in the right places, but she has the affect of a child, and it is most off-putting. So let's go back to the New York Times for our final item, which is about intellectual property. The blurred lines case scared songwriters, but its time may be up. Decisions in copyright cases involving Led Zeppelin and Katy Perry suggest the open season on lawsuits could be coming to an end. It's by Ben Cesario. In the 5 years since a federal jury decided that Robin Thicke's hit song Blurred Lines had copied Marvin Gaye's disco-era standard Got to Give It Up, the music industry has been in an anxious state about copyright. That case and others raise serious questions about the legal protections available for music. When does homage become plagiarism? When does a common chord progression become one songwriter's property? Songwriters and producers worried that their next hit could make them the target of a lawsuit. But the tide may be changing after two court decisions this month addressed important aspects of how copyright applies to music, and in many cases make it more difficult to prove that one song copied another. As Christine LaPera, a lawyer for Katy Perry in a recent copyright suit, put it, the Blurred Lines curse, its chilling effect has been lifted. The catalyst is Led Zeppelin, which was accused of borrowing the pastoral opening to its 1971 classic rock odyssey Stairway to Heaven from a lesser-known song, Taurus, by the band Spirit. The two songs share a similar chord sequence and a bass line that descends along a chromatic scale. Led Zeppelin prevailed at trial, and this month, the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit upheld the jury's verdict. Well, of course, Jimmy Page, the guitarist and lead songwriter of Led Zeppelin, is one of the most notorious plagiarists in history. Unlike the Rolling Stones, which decided that they were not going to rip off the old black bluesmen, they didn't. They did cover versions of blues songs and credited the authors. What Jimmy Page would do would be that he'd get Robert Plant to cook up some hippie nonsense and affix it to an old blues song, and they would give it a new name, and the writing credits would say Page Plant. He did that over and over and over again, but of course, even more notorious than that is the case of Dazed and Confused which is one of Led Zeppelin's most famous songs and one of its most popular, um, they stole this from an American called Jake Holmes. And we know this because when the Yardbirds were in New York City, that was Jimmy Page's old band, he went to see Jake Holmes. That there is a Yardbirds live record which has been produced, which has Dazed and Confused on it, and it is credited to Jake Holmes. But for decades, Led Zeppelin and their lawyers took the position that no, yes, there are recordings of Dazed and Confused by Jake Holmes, but no, we didn't, steal the song just because it's identical. On the other hand, when you talk about, Dazed and Confused is an open and shut case, but there are many that are not open and shut. I'm thinking of a song by the Velvet Underground written by Lou Reed called Sweet Jane. And the number of times that riff has been used by other bands, well, it's clearly in the dozens. Ain't Seen Nothing Yet by Bachman Turner Overdrive, that uses the exact same riff, and I don't recall Lou Reed ever suing. That, many in the business considered nicking a riff to be a kind of homage. I think that Robin Thicke's, his foolishness was in talking about Marvin Gaye, when he was talking about this song. Instead of saying, I suppose what they all say now, no, I don't have any influences. I am a singular genius. And all of my ideas derive from my head entirely. No, I've never listened to much music, actually never cared for it. I can only write songs. I don't listen to other people's songs. Back to the story. In a footnote to its 73-page decision, the Ninth Circuit also explained which constitutes illegal copying when it comes to works that involve generic or commonplace elements. In those cases, the judges said only a minimal or thin level of copyright applies, and a plaintiff must show that a work is virtually identical to defendants. I don't know. It seems sensible to me. Just a week after the Led Zeppelin decision, the judge in Katy Perry's case, in a footnote in a ruling that threw out the verdict of $2.8 million damages against her, those 8 notes were not a particularly unique or rare combination, Judge Snyder wrote, and therefore could not be protected by copyright. Before Led Zeppelin's en banc ruling, plaintiffs were on the roll, said Joseph Fishman, associate professor at the Vanderbilt Law School in Nashville. The next beneficiary may be Ed Sheeran, whose Thinking Out Loud won the Grammy for Song of the Year in 2016. He was accused of copying another Marvin Gaye classic, Let's Get It On. As with Stairway, the Thinking Out Loud suit includes the accusation of a common chord progression, one that a musicologist who analyzed the songs on Sheeran's behalf said is so ordinary that it appears in at least 2 elementary guitar instruction books. Sheeran's case was set to go to trial last fall in New York, but the judge paused the case pending the outcome of the Led Zeppelin appeal. Juries are often told essentially, listen to this song, but only listen to the original part, said Christopher Bucafusco, a professor at Cardozo Law School. Jurisprudence in this area went off the rails as early as 1946 when the Second Circuit established that a jury of lay listeners, rather than judges informed by expert testimony, ultimately decides questions of infringement liability, said Charles Cronin, visiting scholar at George Washington University. I suppose the famous examples they mentioned, Cole Porter's Don't Fence Me In, rum and Coca-Cola would be another example. This litigiousness, it's really untoward, and so much of this has to do with how rich you are and how, what was it? Never judge a man until you have seen his lawyer. This is an old saying. And the Ruddles, there's an example. Neil Innes, who was a friend of George Harrison, he created a fake tribute band that Eric Idle well, Eric Idle doesn't play an instrument, but somehow he became the face of the Ruddles. Neil Innes, who died recently, was a very talented man, very talented guitarist, singer, songwriter. Anyway, so what he did with the Ruddles was, in effect, to make fake Beatles music. Now, he wasn't simply copying the Beatles, but he knew the Beatles music inside out, and such that he was creating songs that sounded like the Beatles, but were not the Beatles. And Piggy in the Middle, or instead of help, ouch. He was a funny guy, Neil Innes. So the Beatles, anyway, their publishers, they sued anyway, despite the friendship with George Harrison, and despite the fact that Innes was clever enough so that he had created wholly original compositions. John Lennon was a fan as well. But no, greedy people wanted more money. And, whenever I hear people carry on about the majesty of the law and such like, I want to consider that if people treated each other the way they should, there would be no need for the law. And of course, how much justice one gets typically depends on how much money one has. And I don't know, litigation, it seems to me, is a bad idea for most people at most times. I've only ever been sued once, as by a ridiculous man called Warren Kinsella. Essentially, he sued me for quoting what he had written in a letter to me. That was a copy of a letter they'd sent to another journalist, and he hadn't changed all the pronouns. The other journalist's name he'd accidentally left in once. So, he issued the suit, but the next stage would have been deposition, which means that he would have had to, flown me and my boss to Toronto and put us up at a hotel. And I guess he decided not to do that. But the most notorious case is A Whiter Shade of Pale by Procol Harum, a song that came out in 1967. And I suppose, what does psychedelic mean, Granddad? Okay, well, you can listen to that song. It's sold more than 10 million copies worldwide, but I believe that there are over 900 covers of it. That's how Bob Dylan got rich. He was doing very well even before he started selling records, because all these other people were having hits with his songs. But King Curtis does a very memorable live version, live at the Fillmore, with his great band, the Kingpins, which you can hear, which I assume you have heard in Widnall and I, many. In any event, Matthew Fisher played the organ on that song, and what he is playing is Bach. The song was credited to the team which wrote all of Procol Harum's songs, although Matthew Fisher got in a few, and Robin Trower, their guitarist in the early days, he got in a few. But so years after this had happened, Matthew Fisher decides that, he was one of the co-writers of the song. And this is one of those lawsuits, that the sort of thing that one reads about in Dickens. He didn't sue until 2005. And this went on for years and years and years. And each side had millions of pounds in legal fees. I believe that Fisher, he did not get all that he wanted. And I suppose it'd be quite some time before the royalties made up for the legal fees. And keep in mind that Matthew Fisher, after he left Procol Harum in the 1970s, he was not exactly a world beater. He rejoined Procol Harum, at one point for a reunion tour. It's very strange, you know. You stole my song. I could have been rich, but yeah, sure, I'll join the reunion. But no, I think I would have should have. You know, I suppose it would have been just better all round if Keith Reed and Gary Brooker had said, "Look, I don't know. How about we give you 10, 20% the song? I mean, you know, if asked, we will deny we made the offer. But you know, how about we don't go to court, right? Save everybody all of this misery and massive expense." But you know, I guess the lawyers they tell you that you know you're going to win eventually, and you know why take 10 or 20% when you could get so much more? Let's see. D. Sturt said, "What JT song did the Eagles rip off?" Yeah, France says Kim's point about getting married is probably because you can't be forced to testify against your spouse. That is absolutely true, and many people were saying that on the comments boards. I think there's more to it than that with Kim Wexler because one of the reasons that she likes Jimmy so much is that he's a con man, and we've seen her participate with great glee in many of his cons, and in fact, you know, suggested cons. No, this live stream is not monetized because yes, I need to have 1,000 subs, and I think I have something like 640. Okay. The Eagles ripped off Jethro Tull. I suppose they might have. Of course, you know, I think it's this Nick Lowe song. What are they? You know, Nick Lowe has also been accused of nicking people. It's pretty. You know, one of his songs, one of his more popular songs, is pretty clearly based on Lightning Strikes by Lou Christie. I mean, you just can't once you hear it, right? Let's see. TBH, you'd be pretty safe taking flights from non-Wuhan China at this point. South Korea has never banned travel from non-Wuhan China, but we wear regular, not N95 masks and cloth mittens a lot. D. Sturt says, LOL, dink is a Canadian word. Literally no one outside of Canada knows what that means. Yeah, I suppose you're right. That this fellow that I worked for in radio, Peter Weisbach, he was born in Germany in 1945. That must have been a droll experience, wouldn't you say? And he had been raised partly in, after his parents left Germany, he was raised, I think, when he was 7 or something, raised partly in the United States, partly in Canada. And, you know, you become rather confused. And once I chided him about the way that he pronounced the word bullshit, that he said bullshit. And I said, you know, anyone from Vancouver knows you're from Vancouver the way you say that word, because no one else says it like that. And I suppose it was one of those aha moments because, you know, people have these habits and they've never really examined them, you know. Let's see. Philip Daniels said, I watched the 1970 film adaptation of Alban Berg's opera Wozzeck tonight. It's on YouTube. You should review it. Yeah, I don't know how much I want to test my audience's resolve to, you know, of my liking for high art. As much, you know, I very much admire Alban Berg. And Wozzeck, it's a very grim story. You know, I had this friend named Rodney Graham in Vancouver, and he is a big deal artist now. When I met him, he was not a big deal artist. He was a friend of mine for several years. We were close at one point. And he was involved in art, conceptual art. He was also a musician. That's primarily how I knew him. But he does this. Well, he's been invited to the you know, Biennale in Venice. Say, here's an example of his art. He takes Ambien, and then he's filmed falling asleep on a bus. Okay. Here's another example of his art. that he had a selection, a small selection of a few pages, a small selection of a few pages from Wozzeck is based on Wojciech by Buchner, another book by Buchner, a few thousand words. And he had this printed, on parchment paper with, again, not cloth, but very heavy paper, like parchment binding. And he gave me a copy. And I said, well, you missed a trick here. He said, what are you talking about? He said, well, you've used staples to bind it. And he said, I shouldn't have used staples. And I said, no, you don't use staples. And he said, why not? And I said, because staples over time will rust and they will stain the paper. And he said, well, what do you do instead? And I said, well, you use sewn signatures. And then I guess he took my advice, because he asked for the copy back and he gave it to me and it had the sewn signatures. Now, I don't have that anymore. And I'm rather dreading looking up how much this is trading for, how many thousands of dollars this is trading for, since my old friend Rodney Graham is now a world-renowned artist. So let's see, anything else in the chat? My Trail of Disgrace says you can get around not being monetized by using Entropy platform. KMG could receive super chats that way, also get a larger percentage then from YouTube/Google. Yes, I will write that down too. Okay, I'm going to wrap up the show. I would like to thank everybody for listening, watching, tuning in. I would appreciate if you like the show or any part of it, if you press the like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel. If you would like to donate to the show, my PayPal address is kevin_grace@hotmail.com. I will be back on the air tomorrow, Wednesday, at 4 p.m. Pacific time, 7 p.m. Eastern time. And I hope that you all have a jolly evening. Bye-bye for now.